The gavel of laughter came before the words did. 14 board members sat around the polished obsidian table on the 40th floor of Cross Tower, and every single one of them was staring at the small, scuffed gold ring on Maya Bennett's finger. Richard Voss, the man who had spent 3 years trying to claw his way into Julian Cross's chair, leaned back and let out a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "Forgive me," he said, "but is that ring from a vending machine? Mrs. Cross, surely the wife of a man worth $11 billion could afford something that doesn't look like it survived a house fire." The room laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Maya did not move her hand. She did not hide it under the table. She looked at her own fingers, at the thin band worn smooth by 15 years of dishwater and worry and love, and she said nothing at all. Julian Cross, who had not said a single word during the entire meeting, who had been sitting so still that people had started to wonder if he'd even noticed the insult, slowly pushed back his chair. The legs scraped against the marble floor like a gunshot in the silence. He stood. He walked around the entire length of that obsidian table, past 14 of the most powerful people in the state, until he was standing in front of his wife. And then, in front of everyone, in front of the board, in front of Richard Voss, in front of his own mother sitting stone-faced at the head of the table, Julian Cross got down on one knee. He took Maya's hand, the one wearing the vending machine ring, and he pressed his lips to it like she was the only person alive who mattered. Before we get into how they got to this moment, and what happened after Julian Cross rose back to his feet and looked Richard Voss dead in the eye, I need you to do something for me. If stories like this mean something to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this with someone who still believes in real love. It helps this channel more than you know. Now, let's go back to where it all started. 9 years earlier, Maya Bennett was 26 years old, and she smelled like fryer oil no matter how many times she washed her hands. She worked the early shift at a diner off Route 9 outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a regular crowd of truckers and old men who tipped in coins. Her mother had died 2 winters before, leaving her a modest house with a leaking roof and a stack of medical bills that would take a decade to pay off. Maya didn't complain. She had never been the type. She woke up at 4 in the morning, put on her uniform, and told herself that tomorrow would be a little easier than today, even when it usually wasn't. Julian Cross was 28 then, and nobody in that diner had any idea who he was, because at that point in his life, he wasn't anybody either. His father had run a small manufacturing company into the ground through pride and bad decisions, and Julian had walked away from the wreckage with nothing but a laptop, an idea about supply chain software, and a stubborn refusal to ask his mother's wealthy side of the family for a single dollar. He came into that diner every morning at 5:30, ordered the same black coffee and the cheapest thing on the menu, and worked on his laptop in the corner booth until the breakfast rush pushed him out. Maya noticed him before he ever said a word to her. Not because he was handsome, though he was in that quiet, dangerous way that made people forget what they were about to say. She noticed him because he tipped exactly what he could afford and not a penny less, because he always folded his napkin instead of leaving it crumpled, because he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. One morning in November, he didn't have enough for his coffee. He counted his change twice at the counter, embarrassed, and started to apologize. Maya slid $1 out of her own tip jar without a word and told the register it was covered. He looked at her like she had handed him something far more valuable than $1. "I'll pay you back," he said. "You don't have to. I will anyway." He did. The next morning, and every morning after that. And somewhere between the coffee and the folded napkins and the corner booth, they started talking. About nothing important. About everything important. Maya learned that he had a business he believed in more than he believed in almost anything. A piece of software that could save companies millions if anyone would just give him a chance to prove it. Julian learned that Maya had given up a nursing scholarship to take care of her dying mother, that she still kept the acceptance letter in a drawer because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away, and that she had never once, in all her hardship, spoken a bitter word about her life. He fell in love with her slowly, the way you fall asleep, not all at once, but so gradually that by the time you notice, it's already happened. He proposed to her on a Tuesday, in the parking lot of that same diner, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, the only thing of value his family had left after the company collapsed. It wasn't a diamond. It was a thin gold band with a small, faded stone that had been in his family for 60 years. He didn't get down on one knee with confidence. He did it with his voice shaking, because he had nothing else to offer her. No house, no savings, no promise that things would get better before they got worse. "I don't have anything," he told her. "I don't know if I'll ever have anything. But I know I don't want to build a life without you standing next to me while I try." Maya said yes before he even finished the sentence. They married in a courthouse with 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway, and Maya wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric she found on clearance. There was no reception. There was a shared plate of fries in the diner parking lot afterward, and Julian telling her again and again that one day he would give her everything she deserved. She told him she already had everything she deserved. For the first 3 years of their marriage, life was hard in a way that tested them both. Julian worked 18-hour days, building his software company from a laptop in their tiny apartment. Maya kept working at the diner and later took a second job cleaning offices at night. And every dollar she earned that wasn't spent on rent or food went quietly into Julian's company without him even knowing at first. There were nights he came home defeated, certain the whole thing was a mistake, certain he was dragging his wife down into a life of struggle she never deserved. Maya never let him believe that for long. She would sit across from him at their small kitchen table, take both his hands, and remind him that failure was only permanent if you stopped trying, and he had never once stopped trying in his life. The turning point came during the worst month of their marriage. Julian's company was 6 weeks from bankruptcy. A supplier had pulled out, a client had backed away, and the bank was threatening to call in a loan Julian couldn't pay. He didn't tell Maya how bad it was, because he didn't want her to worry, but she knew anyway. She always knew. The house Maya's mother had left her, the only thing of value she owned in the world, she sold it. Quietly, without telling Julian until the papers were already signed. She used every dollar to cover the loan, to keep the lights on in his tiny office, to buy him 6 more weeks that turned into 6 more months that turned, eventually, into everything. When Julian found out what she had done, he wept in a way he had never let himself weep before, not even at his father's funeral. He told her she should have asked him first. She told him if she had asked, he would have said no, and they both would have lost everything. "You saved my company," he told her. "You saved me." "I didn't save anything," she said. "I just believed in you before anyone else did. That's not a sacrifice. That's just love." He never sold the story to investors. He never mentioned it in interviews. As his company grew from 6 employees to 600, from a struggling app to Cross Dynamics, one of the largest logistics and technology conglomerates in the country, the story of the house Maya sold stayed locked between the two of them, a secret so private that even his own mother never knew the full truth of how her son's empire had truly been born. By the time Julian Cross was 37 years old, he was worth $11 billion. Forbes put him on their cover. Senators asked for meetings. And through every bit of it, Maya wore the same faded ring he had proposed with in a diner parking lot. Because to her, it wasn't just a ring. It was proof that someone had loved her before he had anything to offer, and that she had loved him back the same way. Julian's mother, Constance Cross, had never approved of Maya. Not once. Not for a single day of the 9 years they'd been married. Constance came from old money, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university libraries, and she had never forgiven her son for marrying, in her words, a waitress with a heart bigger than her bank account. She tolerated Maya at family gatherings the way one tolerates bad weather, with a tight smile and a private wish for it to pass quickly. When Cross Dynamics grew large enough to require a board of directors, Constance made sure she had a seat at that table. And she made sure, over time, to surround herself with people who saw Maya the same way she did, as a liability, a mistake, an embarrassment that had somehow attached itself permanently to the family name. Richard Voss saw an opportunity in that resentment. Voss had joined Cross Dynamics 4 years earlier as chief operating officer, brilliant in the way that ambitious men often are, and desperate to run the company himself. He watched Julian for years, studied his weaknesses, and eventually understood that Julian Cross had exactly one soft point in an otherwise unbreakable armor: his wife. Voss began, slowly and carefully, planting doubts among the other board members. He suggested, in private conversations over expensive dinners, that a CEO's judgment could not be trusted if his personal life showed such obvious lapses in taste. He pointed again and again to the faded ring Maya wore to every gala, every shareholder meeting, every public event, as evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the family running their company. A man who lets his wife embarrass him in public, Voss would say quietly, is a man who might make the same mistake with your money. It was a slow poison, but it worked. By the time Cross Dynamics was preparing for its largest merger in company history, a deal worth close to $4 billion with a European logistics firm, Voss had convinced enough board members, including Constance herself, that a vote of no confidence in Julian's leadership was not just possible, but necessary. Maya knew none of this. She only knew that Julian had been coming home later, sleeping less, saying less. She knew something was wrong, the way she always knew, but this time he didn't tell her. He didn't want her carrying the weight of a war she hadn't started. The board meeting where the vote was scheduled to happen was supposed to be simple. Julian would present the merger numbers. The board would vote to move forward. Voss would lose quietly and disappear back in his office to plan his next move. But Voss had one final card to play, and he played it in front of everyone. He invited spouses to the meeting under the guise of a celebratory lunch before the vote, a small tradition for major milestones. Maya came because Julian asked her to, because he thought, foolishly, that having her there might remind the board of who he really was underneath the billions. He had no idea Voss had planned the entire lunch as a stage for humiliation. It started small. A comment about Maya's simple dress compared to the other wives' designer gowns. A joke about the modest car she still insisted on driving herself, despite having a fleet of luxury vehicles available. Maya absorbed each comment with the same quiet grace she'd carried her whole life, refusing to give Voss the reaction he was hunting for. Then he noticed the ring. "Forgive me," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "but is that ring from a vending machine? Mrs. Cross, surely the wife of a man worth $11 billion could afford something that doesn't look like it survived a house fire." The laughter that followed wasn't just cruelty. It was calculated. Voss wanted Julian to react in anger, to lose his composure in front of the board right before a critical vote, to prove that his judgment could not be trusted when it mattered most. What Voss did not expect was for Julian Cross to stand up, walk the length of that obsidian table, kneel in front of his wife, and kiss her hand like she was the reason his entire empire existed. Because she was. Julian rose slowly to his feet, still holding Maya's hand, and turned to face the entire board. His voice, when it came, was calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. 9 years ago, he said, "I proposed to this woman with this exact ring in the parking lot of a diner because it was the only thing of value my family had left after we lost everything. I told her I had nothing to offer her. She said yes anyway." He let that sit in the silence for a moment before he continued. 6 weeks before this company would have gone bankrupt, before any of you were sitting in these chairs, before this table even existed, my wife sold the only asset she owned in this world, a house left to her by her dying mother, and used every dollar to keep Cross Dynamics alive. She never told a single person. She never asked for credit. She never once, in 9 years, mentioned it to anyone at this table, including my own mother. Constance's face had gone pale. Voss's smug expression had begun to crack. "This ring," Julian said, lifting Maya's hand slightly higher, "is not a symbol of what my wife lacks. It is a symbol of the only thing that actually built this company, someone who believed in me when I had absolutely nothing to offer in return. Every dollar in this room, every deal we're about to sign, exists because of the woman you just mocked for the ring on her finger." Nobody laughed now. Nobody said a word. Julian turned to Richard Voss directly. "You've spent 4 years trying to convince this board that my judgment can't be trusted. Let me make something very clear. The best decision I have ever made in my entire life is sitting right next to me and she made that decision when I was worth nothing at all. If anyone at this table doubts my judgment after hearing that, I welcome the vote. But you should know exactly what you're voting against. The silence stretched long enough that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. And then, slowly, one board member began to clap. Then another. Within seconds, the entire table was on its feet, applauding, except for Richard Voss, who sat frozen, and Constance Cross, who had tears in her eyes she was too proud to explain. The vote never happened that day. Voss resigned 3 weeks later, before the board could vote him out themselves, after 2 separate members quietly informed him that his position had become, in their words, untenable. He left Cross Dynamics with a severance package and a reputation that would follow him through every boardroom he ever tried to enter again. But the story doesn't end there, because 2 days after that meeting, something happened that neither Julian nor Maya expected. Constance Cross showed up at their home, alone, without an assistant or an appointment, for the first time in 9 years of marriage. Maya answered the door herself, the way she always did, and found her mother-in-law standing on the porch looking smaller than Maya had ever seen her look. "I owe you an apology," Constance said, "that I should have given you 9 years ago." She told Maya, standing there on the porch, about her own marriage decades before, how she too had come from nothing, how Julian's grandfather had married her when she had no name and no money, and how somewhere along the way, after wealth had settled in her bones, she had forgotten what it felt like to be looked down upon for having less. She had spent 9 years punishing Maya for the same thing someone had once tried to punish her for, and she was ashamed of it. "That ring," Constance said, looking down at Maya's hand, "used to be mine. I gave it to Julian's grandmother when I could no longer wear it, and she gave it to Julian before she passed, and I never told either of you that. I forgot what it meant. You didn't." For the first time in 9 years, Constance Cross hugged her daughter-in-law. And for the first time in 9 years, Maya let herself believe she had truly become part of this family, not because of what she had, but because of who she had always been. The merger closed 6 weeks later, the largest in company history, and Cross Dynamics stock rose 11% in a single day. But none of that mattered nearly as much to either Julian or Maya as the moment 8 months later when Maya sat across from him at their kitchen table. The same small, worn table they had kept from their first apartment, refusing every designer replacement Constance had ever offered, and told him she was pregnant. Julian cried for the second time in 9 years. Not from fear this time, from joy so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. Their daughter was born the following spring, and Julian insisted, over the objections of nearly everyone in his family, that they name her after the diner where it all began. Not literally, but in spirit, choosing the name Hope, because that was the one thing that diner had given both of them when they had nothing else. At Hope's christening, held not in some grand cathedral, but in the small church near the old diner, which was still standing, still serving black coffee and cheap breakfast to truckers and old men, Maya wore the faded ring one more time. And this time, when people noticed it, nobody laughed, because everyone in that room finally understood what it had always meant. That love, real love, doesn't need to be expensive to be true. It just needs to be there when nothing else is. And it always was. But peace never lasts as long as you want it to. And 6 years later, it was Richard Voss who came back to break it. He had spent those 6 years rebuilding quietly, taking a position at a rival logistics company, waiting, watching, collecting every piece of information he could find about Cross Dynamics from the outside. He never stopped believing that Julian Cross's empire had a crack in its foundation, and he never stopped looking for a way to widen it. He found it in the last place anyone expected, in the hospital records of a small clinic outside Columbus, Ohio, from 9 years before Julian and Maya had ever married. Voss discovered that Maya's mother, the woman whose house had funded Cross Dynamics in its darkest hour, had not died of natural illness the way everyone believed. She had died owing an enormous debt to a private lender, a debt Maya had quietly taken on herself at 19 years old to pay for experimental treatments that ultimately failed, and buried in old paperwork, in a lawsuit that had gone nowhere and been forgotten by everyone except the man determined to destroy the Cross family, was a signature that didn't match. A forged co-signature on a loan document, made by a desperate 19-year-old girl trying to save her dying mother, a technical crime committed out of love and terror rather than malice, but a crime on paper nonetheless. Voss didn't care about justice. He cared about leverage. He sent the documents anonymously to 3 major business journalists on the same morning, timed perfectly with Cross Dynamics' announcement of an even larger merger, an $8 billion deal that would make the company one of the 5 largest logistics conglomerates in the world. The headline that broke by lunchtime was designed to do maximum damage. Cross Dynamics CEO's wife committed fraud as a teenager. What else is she hiding? Julian found out from his lawyer, not from a headline. And by the time he found Maya, she was sitting alone in their living room with her phone in her lap, staring at nothing, her face the color of ash. "I was 19, she said, before he could even ask. "My mother was dying, and the insurance had already denied us twice, and I didn't know what else to do. I signed papers I shouldn't have signed. I forged a cosigner because the lender wouldn't approve the loan without one. And there was no one else, Julian. There was no one else in the entire world who would help me." She had never told him, not because she was hiding something evil, but because the shame of it, the 19-year-old panic of it, had felt too small and too desperate to ever say out loud, even to the man who loved her more than anyone on earth. Julian didn't hesitate. He sat down beside her, took her face in both his hands, and told her the only thing that mattered. "You were a child trying to save your mother's life. If that's a crime, then I don't care what the law says. I care about who you are, and I already know exactly who you are." But the world outside their living room was not nearly as forgiving. Within 24 hours, 3 of Cross Dynamics' largest institutional investors had called emergency meetings. The board, still rebuilding trust after the Voss scandal years earlier, was terrified of the merger collapsing under the weight of a public relations crisis. Constance Cross, who had spent 6 years becoming one of Maya's fiercest defenders, found herself fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the press outside the family, and against nervous board members inside it who whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment to distance the company from the controversy entirely. The merger partners in Europe threatened to walk away within the week unless Cross Dynamics could prove the allegations were either false or irrelevant to current operations. Maya wanted to resign from public life entirely. She told Julian she would disappear quietly, take hope, stay out of every photograph and every gala, if it meant saving the company he had built from nothing. Julian refused to even consider it. Instead, he did something no one expected, something that would become, years later, one of the most talked-about moments in modern corporate history. He called a press conference himself, without lawyers standing beside him, without a prepared statement written by a PR firm, and he brought Maya with him, holding her hand the entire time in front of every camera in the building. 9 years ago, he told the room, my wife sold everything she owned to keep this company alive when I had nothing left to offer anyone. 19 years before that, she signed a piece of paper she shouldn't have signed because she was a terrified teenager trying to save her dying mother's life, and no bank in this country was willing to help her do it legally. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that was the right decision. It wasn't. But I'm also not going to stand here and let anyone tell me that a frightened 19-year-old girl trying to save her mother is the same thing as a criminal trying to steal from a company. He turned, then, and looked directly into the main camera. If this merger falls apart because a group of desperate investors are more concerned with an old, forgivable mistake than with a woman who quite literally saved this company from bankruptcy, then perhaps this was never the right partnership to begin with. It was a gamble that could have ended everything. Instead, within 72 hours, something remarkable happened. The story shifted. Journalists who had originally run with Voss's leaked documents began digging deeper, uncovering not a scandal, but a story of a desperate teenage girl failed by a broken system, married to a man now refusing to abandon her for it. Public sentiment, rather than turning against Maya, turned fiercely in her favor. Social media filled with stories from other people who had once made similar desperate choices trying to save sick parents, people who saw themselves in Maya Cross for the first time. The lender who held the original forged loan, tracked down by an enterprising reporter, admitted publicly that he had suspected the co-signature was false at the time and had approved the loan anyway out of sympathy for a dying woman's daughter, effectively closing off any possibility of real legal consequence. And the trail that led back to who had leaked the documents in the first place led, eventually and inevitably, straight back to Richard Voss. It turned out that in his desperation to destroy Julian Cross once and for all, Voss had illegally accessed sealed hospital and legal records through a former contact still working inside the county courthouse system, a clear federal crime that made his 6-year campaign of quiet revenge suddenly spectacularly public. Voss was arrested 11 days after his own scandal broke, on charges of illegal record access and corporate espionage, in a case that made even bigger headlines than the one he had tried to create. Sentenced to 18 months and permanently barred from serving on any public company's board again, he became, in the end, exactly the villain the story needed to make Maya's courage shine even brighter. The merger closed anyway, 3 weeks late, but fully intact, and Cross Dynamics stock hit an all-time high the following month. But none of that was what Julian and Maya remembered most from that terrifying, brutal week. What they remembered was the night before the press conference, when Maya, certain she was about to destroy everything Julian had built, sat across from him at their same small kitchen table and told him she understood if he needed to protect the company first. Julian had taken her hand, the same hand he had knelt to kiss in front of the entire board years before, and told her something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. You saved this company once with a house. You saved it again just now, simply by being honest with me. I am not choosing a company over you. There has never been a version of my life, rich or poor, successful or failing, where I choose anything over you. You are not a liability I'm managing, Maya. You are the entire reason any of this was ever worth building. Hope was 7 years old during that terrifying week, too young to understand mergers and headlines and forged signatures, but old enough to notice her mother crying quietly at the kitchen table one night. She had climbed into Maya's lap, small arms wrapping around her mother's neck, and said the only thing a 7-year-old knows how to say in moments too big for her to understand. Daddy says you're the bravest person he knows. I think he's right. Maya kept that memory closer than almost any other, closer even than the boardroom moment that had once defined their whole marriage in the public eye, because it reminded her that whatever the world thought it knew about her, her daughter already knew the only truth that mattered. 2 years after the scandal, Cross Dynamics opened a foundation, quietly funded and entirely run by Maya herself, offering emergency medical loans to families facing exactly the impossible choice she had once faced at 19, sick parents, no insurance, no legal way to get help fast enough. Within its first year, the foundation had helped more than 4,000 families avoid the exact desperate decision that had once nearly destroyed Maya's life decades later. She never sought credit for it. She never gave interviews about it. But every single loan application processed through that foundation carried, quietly printed at the bottom of the paperwork, 5 words that Maya had insisted on herself. You are not alone anymore. Constance Cross, in her final years, became the foundation's most vocal supporter, telling anyone who would listen at every gala and shareholder meeting that the woman she had once dismissed as a waitress with a heart bigger than her bank account had turned out to have the only kind of wealth that actually mattered in the end. Julian Cross, years later, when asked in a rare interview what the secret to his success had truly been, didn't mention strategy or timing or ambition. He held up his own hand, the plain wedding band he still wore, matching in spirit if not in metal to the faded ring Maya had worn since a diner parking lot proposal decades before. The secret, he said, was falling in love with someone who believed in me before I had anything worth believing in. Everything else was just details. Maya still has that ring today. She still wears it to every gala, every shareholder meeting, every important event, faded gold and all, and not a single person has ever laughed at it again. Because now, everyone understands exactly what it's worth. 20 years passed the way 20 years do, quietly, and then all at once. Hope Cross was 26 years old now, the same age her mother had been the morning she slid $1 out of her own tip jar for a stranger who couldn't afford his coffee. Hope had grown up surrounded by more wealth than most people see in 10 lifetimes, private schools, a name that opened doors before she even knocked, and yet she had chosen, against the quiet worry of everyone around her, to become a nurse. Nobody understood why, until the day she cleaned out an old drawer in her mother's study and found a yellowed acceptance letter to a nursing program, dated more than 3 decades earlier, addressed to a young woman named Maya Bennett. Never opened, never used, kept anyway. Hope sat on the floor of that study for an hour, holding the letter, understanding for the first time the shape of the sacrifice that had quietly built the life she'd been given. She didn't need her mother to explain it. She simply understood. That same week, Cross Dynamics held its annual shareholders gala. The same event, the same obsidian table in a newer, taller building, the same kind of powerful people gathered to celebrate another record year. Maya was 61 now, silver threading through her hair, the ring still on her finger, fainter than ever, held together in one spot by a jeweler who had refused, every single time she brought it in, to replace the stone. A young junior board member, new to the company, new to money, leaned toward a colleague and murmured, just loud enough, "Is that ring real? I heard Mrs. Cross could buy the entire jewelry district, and she still wears that thing." The room went quiet, the way rooms do when they remember a story. It was Hope who answered, standing up from her seat before her father could even rise from his chair, her voice steady in a way that made half the room recognize, all at once, exactly whose daughter she was. "That ring paid for this company's survival before any of you were sitting at this table," she said. "It's the only thing in this building that was never for sale." Julian looked at his daughter, then at his wife, and felt something settle deep in his chest, a certainty that whatever came after them, whatever boardrooms and mergers and headlines the future still had waiting, the truth they had built their whole life on would keep walking forward long after they were gone. Maya reached over and took her daughter's hand under the table, the same way she once took a stranger's dollar and gave it without asking for anything back, and she thought, not for the first time, that some inheritances have nothing to do with money at all. The gala continued. The deals were signed. The applause came and went the way it always does in rooms like that. But somewhere outside the city, on Route 9, an old diner still stood, still served black coffee for $1.50, still had a bell over the door that rang every time someone walked in tired and hoping for something better. And some mornings, if you got there early enough, you'd still find a booth in the corner where, decades ago, 2 people with nothing had quietly decided to build everything.